Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, thank you for coming. I would like to ask you before I start if you have questions, to please wait the end of the performance to ask them. Thank you. The title of this performance I presented for the first time in 1999 is Product of Circumstances. In 1987, I started to work on my thesis for my PhD in molecular and cellular biology, and at the same time, I began to take one dance class a week. I finished my master's degree, and I received a scholarship from the French government to write my thesis. The same year, I was admitted to work in a laboratory specializing in research on breast cancer and hormones. Also, I started to see a lot of dance performances during the summer festivals in the south of France, where I lived. The same year was the painful ending of a 3 years long love relationship. I was still playing a lot of basketball, and my body was trying to get some stretch. Can we change the light, please, and put the projector on? Thank you. The title of my thesis I presented in October 1990 was Study of Oncogenes Expression and Hormonal Regulation in Breast Cancer using Quantitative In Situ Hybridization. When I was in the laboratory, my task was to study in vivo the expression of oncogenes in breast cancer. Oncogenes are genes that, after alteration at a structural or expressive level, have the ability of transformation and are then part of some cancer mechanisms. As we know, oncogenes can be altered by the punctual mutation, genetic rearrangement, amplification, or overexpression of the oncogenes. The usual techniques used to study the RNA or protein expression are not well adapted to detect gene expression in human biopsies, because most of the time the biopsies that we can have are too small for a quantity of RNA and protein expression. So we choose to develop the technique of in situ hybridization, because with this technique it is possible to detect very low quantities of RNA expression, and it's also possible to localize this expression in the studied tissue. In situ hybridization reveals the presence of messenger RNA on tissue sections by using a probe of the tested gene, which is marked radioactivity. After hybridization, we observe the tissue section under the microscope, and the presence of messenger RNA is visible as black dots or grains that we can see on the tissue sections. I would like to show you some examples for this. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is a section of a ductal breast carcinoma, which was hybridized by the oncogene c-MYC. And as you can see, after hybridization, when we look at the section under the microscope, we can see these black dots on the cells, which shows that this oncogene is expressed in this tissue. Next slide, please. So this is also a section that time from a ductal breast carcinoma, which was also hybridized with the oncogene c-MYC. And as you can see, in this breast cancer, in this biopsy, this oncogene is also expressed. And what is very clear on this picture is that you have the expression in some area of the tissue, like up there or here, but not in other. That shows how this technique allows us to localize where the oncogene is expressed. Next slide, please. Here again, the same observation. The c-MYC oncogene tested in this biopsy is expressed in certain part of the tissue and not others. But what is also very clear between the two last examples is that the number of grains or dots in this biopsy is much lower than the previous one. And that shows how we can differentiate the level of expression of this oncogene using this technique. Next slide, please. Okay, we can turn off the projection and change the light, please. Thank you. So, as you could see on this example, the technique allows the localization and the expression of the tested gene, and the different examples show also a clear difference in the quantity of grains. But to get usable results from these experiments, we had to be able to translate them into numbers for making comparative and quantitative studies of the RNA expression that we could use also for statistic studies. So, of course, it was possible to count the grains visually, one by one, but it takes about 2 hours to count the grains on each chosen field that we observe under the microscope. So you have to imagine for this kind of studies, you will maybe test 50 different biopsies. We will test, let's say, 4 to 10 oncogenes for each oncogenes, and each biopsy you will do the experiment at least 10 times, observed at least 10 sections, area under the microscope. So each time multiplied by 2 hours, this is an enormous amount of time of counting for the grains. So my first task in the laboratory was to develop, in collaboration with computer scientists from the corporation IMSTA in Paris, a method for mechanically counting the level of RNA detected by in situ hybridization on tissue sections. To count the black dots mechanically, we use a microscope connected to a camera and a computer with a software which was developed specifically for this task. First, we select a field from the studied tissue section under the microscope. Then we take a picture from this field with the video camera that is on top of the microscope. This picture then goes into a computer where it is digitized, and the digitized pictures appear on a video monitor where the processing of the counting can be followed. Using this technique, it takes us 10 minutes with the help of the computer to count one field observed under the microscope. This was already much better than the 2 hours needed for a visual counting. So it was a real progress, and these results were published, and it was the first time that I participated in a scientific publication. At that time, I was taking 2 or 3 dance classes a week, and I was trying to learn how to do these kinds of exercises. And also this kind of thing. During this period, I spent a lot of time looking at sections of human tissues under the microscope, trying to learn how to recognize the histological differences between normal and cancer cells, and also between the different types of cancers. I remember that even for the very experienced researchers, sometimes it was difficult to make a clear and objective decision to put the observed tissue in one of the numerous existing categories. But the decisions had to be as objective as possible. And I remember looking into the microscope, I very often had the feeling that I was both observing and transforming what I was observing. I had the feeling that my decisions were made under influence, and I thought every decision actually challenged my objectivity. And I thought that I actually could not be objective. So I started to ask myself at this time, how objective do I have to be able to continue to practice science, or more specifically, biomedical research? But I quickly forgot these thoughts and put them on the side in order to be able to continue my work of research in the laboratory. And after we developed this mechanical method of quantification, we first studied the expression of oncogenes from the group of the fibroblast growth factor-like genes. We tested 6 different genes and oncogenes in 20 breast cancer biopsies. The level of expression of these oncogenes were very low and at the limit of detection. And actually, this work became the first subject of discord with Henri Rochefort, who was my laboratory director. We argued a lot, and I quickly found out that his experience and social position was much more important than any scientific argument I could give. The discussions were rarely about scientific problems or questions. It was all about career, power, and hierarchy. He wanted to publish the results, and I thought that they were not relevant enough to be published. I was learning the importance of publication and that publishing articles is the scientist's best way to create and protect his position in a society. Like researchers used to say, publish or perish. I was learning that research has to follow and use the methods of capitalism or every other name that you would like to give to the process that dominate the actual word history. I was asked to produce science, but not to search. And at that time, I took at least one dance class a day. I also started to do some yoga, and I began to visit an osteopath regularly. These corporal experiences laid the foundation for the necessity of new corporalities and new theories about the human body. The next step of my work in the laboratory was to study the regulation in vivo of oncogenes with tamoxifen. Tamoxifen is a chemical used for breast cancer therapy because it has the ability to inhibit the effect of steroid hormones, which probably play a role in the development of breast cancer. So we studied the effect of tamoxifen on the RNA levels of 4 different oncogenes: c-MYC, CRBB2, HST, and INT2. We tested this in 19 breast cancer biopsies from patients who were treated by tamoxifen 3 weeks prior surgery. We then compared these results with what we call the control population, made out of 22 control patients who were not treated by tamoxifen prior surgery. The RNA levels were measured by in situ hybridization and with the computer-aided quantification, as I described before. We found that all 4 oncogenes were expressed in the breast epithelial cells and that the expression in the stromal tissue was negligible. And I will show you now some examples for this. So can we put the projector on, please? And change the light. Thank you. Let me take this. So we can skip this. Oh, we skip this too. Maybe I go here, see better. Okay, so that's a section of an invasive ductal breast carcinoma which was hybridized with the oncogene c-MYC. And as you can see, this oncogene is expressed in this tissue because we have these black dots appearing on the cells. But what is very clear on this example is that the expression is localized in the epithelial cells, like up there or here, and the expression in the stromal tissue all around is negligible. Next slide, please. So this is a section coming from the same biopsy. It's the next section. You can also recognize the pattern of the epithelial tissue. But this time, this was hybridized with oncogene CRBB2. As you can see, this oncogene is highly expressed in this biopsy. The quantity of grain is the highest we could ever detect. But again, the expression is localized on the epithelial tissue cells on these 2 parts, but is negligible all around in the stromal tissue. Next slide, please. Here are reported the expression of the oncogene c-MYC and CRBB2 in the control population and in the population treated by tamoxifen. As you can see here, we found a significant difference of expression between these two populations for both oncogenes, with a p-value for c-MYC of 0.018 and for CRBB2 a p-value of 0.0003, so very, very significant. Next slide, please. The result for the expression of the oncogene HST and INTER2 were much less spectacular, because these two oncogenes are part of this group of growth factor-like genes which are very low, which have a very low expression in the biopsy we tested. Here is an example of one of the biopsy where we could find the highest expression of these oncogenes, which is about 8 to 9 grains per cells. Next slide, please. Here are reported like before, but this time for the oncogene HST and INTER2, the expression in the control population and in the population treated by tamoxifen. We could not find any significant difference of expression between both populations for both of the oncogenes. Next slide, please. So we used these results of expression of these oncogenes in these populations of biopsies to see if we could find any correlation between the expression of these oncogenes and parameters or factors that play a role in the development of breast cancer. We looked, for example, for a possible correlation between the amplification and the expression of these oncogenes in the control population and the population treated by tamoxifen. And we found that the oncogene CRBB2 and HST have a correlation between their expression and amplification of this oncogene, with a p-value of CRBB2 of 0.0005, so very significant, this correlation between amplification and expression, and for a p-value of 0.2 for HST in the control population. We could not find any correlation between amplification and expression of the other oncogene in none of the population. Next slide, please. So we also found something very interesting when we looked at the correlation of the effect of tamoxifen on the expression of these oncogenes and the presence or absence of estrogen receptors. We found a correlation between the effect of tamoxifen on the expression of the oncogene c-MYC in the population which has estrogen receptors, and this with a p-value of 0.04. And very surprisingly, we found a correlation of the effect of tamoxifen on the expression of CRBB2 in the population which doesn't present any estrogen receptors, with a p-value of 0.02. So it seems that these two oncogenes are regulated and affected by tamoxifen, but the mechanism apparently is different for both of these oncogenes. We can change the light, please, and turn off the projector. Thank you. So, as a conclusion for these results, and that was also the conclusion of my thesis that I presented in 1990, the results suggest that tamoxifen in vivo decreases c-MYC and CRBB2 RNA levels in breast cancer cells and has no effect on the expression of HST and INTER2. And it seems that the mechanisms of regulation of these two oncogenes by anti-estrogens are different. Tamoxifen seems to be able to interfere at both DNA and RNA levels, and using or not an interaction with the estrogen receptors. So to study these different mechanisms, the approach would be, for example, to develop an experimental protocol using, for example, different lineages of breast cancer cells presenting different estrogen receptor status or different status of amplification of these oncogenes. But I had, from these 3 years of work in the laboratory, some other conclusions and questions. For example, I was asking myself, can we trust statistics? What is the meaning of statistical results? And in regard to statistics, I would like to quote here some material about the risks of breast cancer, which were pointed out by Yvonne Rainer in her movie Murder and Murder. She says that it was reported in very serious scientific journal that lesbians have a 2 to 3 times higher risk of developing breast cancer than heterosexual women, which means, between other conclusions that you can make about these statistics, that when a woman comes out as a lesbian, she is more exposed to breast cancer from one day to the other by changing her relationship toward women. During my practice of science, I also ask myself, what is the aim in getting more and more specialized? Is it the way to understand the human body, for example? It seemed to me very strange, more and more, to study the human body by isolating microsystems out of their context for an analysis in a laboratory environment. This experimental system, like any other technical scientific disposition, is responsible for its results. It imposes the answers to problems which might not be longer about the original questions, but about their transformation. And I thought that trying to understand the cell as a microcosm of our body could be a very interesting model if it were not described and studied only by using mechanistic systems that finally tries to make a myth out of it. I understood that the human body is not organized only in the way that biology tries to organize it. So all these remarks may sound pretty naive, but I had the feeling that science was about understanding problems which were made up to give us the impression, and maybe the satisfaction, of a sort of control on the question that we can have. And I had another idealistic idea of science, and I slowly lost my belief in it. I lost this very distinguished belief specific to science, which is presented as the right of access to truth and to a different world. These 3 years of work in the laboratory taught me that doing research is for 50% of the time making reports, writing articles for publications, or proving that you are actually working on a productive subject. 30% of the time is used to think about how you could be productive, and the rest of the time is for experiments, observations, and analysis. So I realized that research in biology was a lot about power and politics, and rarely about an understanding of the human body, which was, I think, my primary interest. So maybe my experience is very specific to biomedical research and to work in this laboratory. And maybe it would have been different if I had done fundamental research in physics, for example. But it was not the case. So in 1990, after I presented my thesis, I quit my career as a molecular biologist, I escaped, and I decided to do more dance. Thinking became a corporal experience. My body became simultaneously active and productive, object and subject, analyzer and analyzed, product and producer. And I went to Paris, where I took more dance classes, and I did some of these. During this year in Paris, I went to audition, and I remember that one time I was refused because I was too skinny. But most of the time, I was not accepted because of my lack of technique. So I tried to practice more of this. It didn't really help. And my enthusiasm for dance was mixed with disappointment and a feeling of exclusion. Somehow, my body was resisting the norms of dance. So maybe I was too old, or maybe there was something wrong with my body, and maybe it was this. After a year of dance classes and auditions, I finally got a job as a dancer in a company called La Compagnie de l'Alambic. We were improvising to produce movement, and we were trying to express something by creating movement sequences that were supposed to answer our questions and desires. I also had to learn movements composed by the choreographer and other dancers in order to be part of group dances. And most of the time, this was very difficult for me. And I will now show you an excerpt of one of these dances. in 1992, I moved to Berlin for reasons of love. In Berlin, except for one or two groups, I found the dance scenes not very exciting. But I began to practice a little bit of contact improvisation, and I also took some Alexander technique classes. And these experiences changed a lot of my perceptions about the human body. And at the same time, after a year I was in Berlin, I began to work with a group called Detector. This multidisciplinary group was using as well video, theater, songs, dance, mixing everything to make performances. And working with them, I began to ask myself questions about the definition of dance. And at the same time, I was more and more disappointed by most of the performances that I saw. Watching a lot of them from a lot of different groups coming from all over, I could less and less imagine working with one of these groups, companies, or choreographers. So in 1993, I began to work alone. My body became the practice of a critical necessity, and I began to use my body for questions about body images, identity, differences. And I started to work on creating functions and dysfunctions of the body, of my body, with quite an analytical method that some would call scientific. And the first choreographies that I did were constructed by creating links between fragments of bodies that were voluntarily taken apart, maybe as a biologist would do to analyze them, and performing the movements was about inscribing something that could be described as a go-between for mind and body, and try to see that as a moving entity. And at that time, I think it was a way to try to redefine the mind-body opposition and to work on the idea that just as the mind organizes the rest of the body's tissue into a life process, sensations and perceptions, to a large degree, organize the mind. Sensations and perceptions do not simply give the mind material to organize. They are themselves a major organizing principle. But this doesn't mean that dance and choreography should only be about sensations and perceptions. I don't think that choreography is reduced to handle these questions. On the opposite, I think that choreography has a much wider field of action. And since 1995, these reflections have been enriched by a collaboration with Laurent Goldring, a friend, who questions the status of body pictures or human figures within the history of photography and produce video works as well as text. This collaboration helped me to continue my research, which at that time was centered on deconstructing and reconstructing my body to produce movement sequences. So I have already showed two different examples of this, extracts from a triptych which is called Narcissus Flip. And I will now show another one from Burke, which is the title of the third part of the triptych. The first choreographies I worked on were presented during private events, which were called pressure presents. The first one was at the end of 1993. It was the proposition of Alexander Birntraum, a friend who is musician and musicologist, who suggested me that we could offer each other music or dance to force ourselves to find a form to present what we were doing. It was a way to take the works out of an exclusively personal experience and find a direct exchange without engaging all the dynamics of theater organization to present the work. The decision on the presentation of a piece was proposed by the other, and it could be dance, music, or anything else, and it was done very, very quick, and the exchange out of this was very rich. And after that, we have been actually invited to present some works which emerge out of this pressure presence. And we presented this work in a couple of venues. And a little bit later, in 1996, I got also some support for the first time from institutions from the city of Berlin. And I was invited to be artist in residence at the Podeville, which is a contemporary art center in Berlin, was a contemporary art center. And I started to be invited also to present different works in different places in Europe. But this small success or recognition were slightly changing my way of thinking. And I realized that I was losing a certain kind of independence. I slowly noticed that the system for dance production had created a format that influenced, and sometimes to a large degree, determined how a dance piece should be. I think that to a large extent, dance producers and programmers have to follow the rules of the global economy. And I had integrated the economical dynamics of dance production because I wanted to be able to make a living with what I had decided to do. But even though I was very careful not to bow to that particular logic, and I tried to resist, I was not always completely convinced by my decisions. And it reminded me of some earlier experiences and made me think about utopic and idealistic reasons that made me give up the work of research in medical biology. Somehow, my point of view and my status in the society had changed, but I found myself in a blurred field of similarities between the social and political organizations of science and dance. I felt like a fugitive who actually never escaped what he thought he was escaping. I had a need to change the way of changing, and I had the need for more critical work. But at the same time, I realized that the content of a piece is not enough for a critical position. And during the same period, around 1996, I had the luck to be invited to join the Quatuor Albrecht Knust, a French dance company that is working on the recreation of dance pieces that have played an important role in our modernity. The project was to work on the recreation of continued project Alter Daily, a piece by Yvonne Rainer that she created in 1970. This project was very important for me, and it still has a very big influence on my work. It was more than a way to access to the history of dance through the practice of it, which was already a great experience, but it also proposed a lot of answers to my questions, because the project was very aware of all the aspects implied in the production of a dance piece. For example, the practice of dance questions the body and the process of work, as well as the composition methods, trying to relate everything with social or political questions. For example, the way of working in a group and how the responsibilities are distributed is questioned during the process of work as well as during the performance. And he tries always to challenge the established hierarchies. It was also a lot of fun to do, and I will now demonstrate two parts of this choreography. The first one is called running, and the second part is called the chair and pillow dance. After this experience, it became more difficult than ever to think about producing a dance piece. Sometimes I even thought that it's impossible to do anything else. But I still had the feeling that it's a field where the questions about bodies and their representations could be explored. So after this, I have tried to work on questions such as the following. Can the production of a dance piece become the process and the production in itself without having to become a product in terms of a performance or a representation? What kind of organization do I want to use for which body, for which process of work, for which performance? Is it possible to work on all these parameters at the same time? What is performance? What is representation? Is the human body an extension of the environment, and the environment an extension of the body? As Elizabeth Gross suggests in her book Volatile Bodies, the human body is not a stable system or a centered organization, neither at the historical level, neither at the biological level, nor at the historical, psychological, or cultural levels. And she also suggests that any body image is a continuous process of production and transformation. So, considering this, a perspective of work in the choreography field could be to look for ways to change the predetermined organization of the body in order to transform the form of performance and representation. that was the beginning of a piece called Self Had Finished that I was working on in 1998 when I was invited by Martin Spangberg, Christophe Vavlet, and Hortensia Furkers to participate in an event about performance and theory, which was called Body Currency. I was invited because, as a dancer or choreographer, my currency in a society of the spectacle is to be an atypical dancer and sometimes a dancer biologist. For this event, I was asked to think about possible theoretical pathways between biology and performance. It was for me a very interesting challenge to try to make something out of this. But at the same time, it was impossible to get to an abstract and theoretical level. I could not generalize or conceptualize as much as I wish. And I could not write a real paper or do a lecture. So I decided to stay at a personal level and give some information about possibilities of exchange that I had experienced and use this as a support for different thoughts. I was afraid, but I took the risk of being maybe too egocentric, hoping that I could provoke some questions. And this is how I came to produce what I just presented to you this afternoon. And now, to end this lecture, I would like to suggest that this performance was about a contaminated body in its weavings of historical, social, cultural, and biological levels, being the place and time for a pathway of different thoughts, unable to transform themselves completely into abstraction and theory. And maybe theory is biography, presenting it is a lecture, and doing a lecture is performing. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, as I suggested at the beginning of the performance, I'm happy to answer questions if you have some, and we have a microphone that we should use in order that everybody hear. People who need to leave, please do so. People who didn't yet decide, please do so. Decide and stay or go. Maybe we can put this slide up here so that no question? Yes, there is one question here.
My question is really simple. I was wondering if somebody were to ask you, somebody who didn't know you were to ask you, what do you do? What would you say to that? What would be your answer?
I usually say I do choreography. And
Thanks.
And I perform them also sometimes. You have some?
Hi, I was wondering, when you left science and you started working on your own, you mentioned that you were still using somewhat of a scientific method in your rehearsals. And I'm wondering why you chose to use those sorts of methods, and if that's the case.
Yeah. So what I actually exactly say is that I didn't choose that consciously, but that's what people say about it. So it's not a choice to use this method and translate them or transform them to make art. But at the same time, as I studied and worked in this field for 10 years, I think it's, even if I would want not to, like with my biggest will, there are certain things that that are embodied in my way of approaching the world and my way of doing things. So I think, for example, an approach that can be analytical is something that I have learned in these years of study. Or you can also think maybe I was born like this, or both.
When you said you were a fugitive to what you're trying to leave behind, when you stopped doing research.
Sorry, I didn't understand. When I said what?
When you stopped doing research and you said you felt like a fugitive to what you're trying to leave behind, and that's why you stopped doing science. But then you found that doing dance, you're still within that box, I suppose. Do you think that would happen in anything you do that requires viewing of other people? Or some sort of...
I think yes, but if you have an alternative, I'm very happy to follow.
That's the thing. I don't see what an alternative would have been for you to not feel like a...
Yeah, well, let's say I was very naive when I was 25 years old. I thought in the field of choreography or art it would be different. And I needed to make the experience to understand that there is something else than the subject or the profession that you choose. And that there are, not that I know, like organization that or topics or works that can really escape what, like this need of production. So they are maybe alternative, but they are never totally, from my perspective, they're never totally free of this imperative.
Thank you.
In your retrospective upstairs and here as well, it seems like there's a lot of conversation in your work, and I was wondering why that is and what it adds to the dance.
It's not supposed to add to dance. It's a mean of performing, I guess, and exchanging. That is include and important for me in what I do. It is most of the time to try to look for the articulation that might exist between the things and try to not have a split between if you dance you don't think, and if you think you don't dance, or something like this. And simply to say when we dance we think it's not enough, and when you... So conversation is a very often used to explore this relationship, and of course to work on that relationship too, which is of a different nature if we start to talk together like we do now. Hey, this person should get the microphone because in the middle it's difficult to access.
Hi, I have a question about the last piece you have performed. In that piece, you almost operate your body as a machine. I wonder if there is any connection between operate yourself as a machine and try and with isolate your body. Disconnect with the circumstance around your body. These two ideas related? Should I articulate it again?
Maybe, but maybe you have the answer.
No. But I wonder why machine imitate the machine can isolate a human body to the circumstance. I don't see the connection here.
Well, a machine is clearly made out of parts. So there are some model of thinking the body made out of parts. But it's a different way of thinking parts. The parts of a machine you can take away and separate, the part of the body not. So if this is the idea of a part can be separate from the rest, then our body is not made in parts. So system, or it's a thought about organization. But what I do in this excerpt is actually, it appears like a machine, but my attention when I perform it is to associate a part of the body to a sound and to try to play with the not knowing who produced the other. Do I start the movement or do I start the sound? Do I stop the movement or do I stop the sound? So that's what I try to perform. Maybe that's an answer to your question.
Thanks.
Hi, hello, thank you. My understanding is that this work, Product of Circumstances, was from 1999, and I was wondering what was the impetus to use a lecture format for you?
As I said in a piece, the lecture format is actually proposed by the context for which this piece was done. Originally, when I was asked to do this, something about biology and performance or dance and science, it was for this event, Body Currency, which was trying to put together a question about practice and theory in the same space and trying to bridge them or to not differentiate them. And that's in this context that the piece, for this context that the piece has been done. When I did the work, I was not planning that I would perform it 15 years or what is it, this many years after. I thought this piece would be for that. But the response in that context was pointing at this work being a theater work, although it was intended to be some kind of strange object. So I tried to perform it in another frame, in a frame of a dance festival in Berlin, so presented as a choreography to test to experiment what would be the response or what could that produce. And the piece continued to be presented. So the format of the lecture is made by the context, and of course now transformed, the meaning of it is transformed by the other context when it's performed.
I can pass this after.
Yeah, go.
No, I was just thinking about the part in the performance where you talk about the percentage of time producing in science, and then the percentage of time thinking about how or what you're going to produce, and the very small percentage of time which is allotted to research.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you think about those percentages in your contemporary art, dance practice. Because science and contemporary art both have a certain expectation to produce new thought or ideas or whatever. New is important in both fields, and I'm just wondering, how do you think about research in your choreographic life?
I think it's very similar, although I would put different terms. I think since this was said in 1990 about working in the end of the 80s, it's also important to see when time at what in which period this is this point at. I think now, how much is this? 30 years later, something like this. There is something that appears which I would call administration of life in work. I don't know exactly this frontier between this, which is probably taking over the 50% of the time that I was referring to about writing articles, publication, and proof that you are actually productive. I think it's in my working existence now. It's the same, and yeah. Also, so not the looking how to be productive. This is also, of course, a little bit cynical or a little bit aggressive, but I think, yeah, it operates. I'm not totally free of that. I have come up sometime with a strategy to avoid this, which, for example, before the first works I was doing, before I started to ask for subsidies, so this is a context of Europe, where we have the luck to have to be able to have subsidy to produce the work, and if you enter the machinery somehow, being a little bit lucky, you can sustain work through the public subsidies. And my attitude to that at the beginning was to ask subsidies for a piece that I had done with my friend, like this pressure presents were used for that. I would do work and do it for this event, and out of this, there's a work. I would ask subsidy for that work that nobody saw, but it was always already done. So then I would use the money to do something else, to survive doing something else. Nobody should know also. So somehow I had this place, writing the project which is already done, which is easier also to write a project that is, because that's also the trap, I think, that the project-oriented economy has produced. You have to know what you will do in order to ask the subsidy that the people will give you to do what you want to do. This is very difficult to think research in these terms, or it means a certain kind of research, and there we are very close to what my comment I was telling in the field of science that I experienced 30 years ago. It's very, very similar. Yeah. What kind of activity? Well, it's difficult. The borders are very blurred. That's also maybe not specific for this activity of producing art, but like if we follow this project economy based the activity that we are in when we produce, or that I am in producing art. So that would be where is the research? The research is sometimes before writing the project, like the application. I think that's there is a moment that I would call research, and then the moment you try to give it form, so there are other levels of research that enter there. Yeah, I don't know. Whatever. Here or behind you and after. Ah, okay.
Yeah, well, I was wondering if when you look at a specific discipline and the way that discipline tries to address certain questions and find answers to certain questions, like the scientific method, if in a way you focused on looking at the limitations of those methods in trying to address questions. And in any established field, there are limits in the way that established field can address questions, and it's a method itself of looking at those limits is another method to address certain questions, and in that sense it's a little bit by nature an interdisciplinary approach to try to look at those questions that and those domains where you hit the limits of a particular established field, and isn't that a little bit what you're doing, is to try to find those, focus on those limits of established
I'm
methods.
not looking for the limit. They come to me. I bounce to them. I think I'm not trying to look for. That's what I try to explain in a way, like starting by my body suddenly, because I want to do this, is a limit in itself. I didn't look for my body. It is a construction that I have some possibility to transform, but with a very limited range of possibility in a way of what is given somehow. So it's more like this that I operate. It's like there is a limit. It affects me, so I can of course turn away and go somewhere else, which somehow is what I did with the field of science. But as I understood after that, I could do this infinitely. Then the try now is more like when I encounter limits to try to push it or transform it in order to be able to continue.
One question. The product of circumstances stops at one time during your development. Do you think you're going to add? I mean, do you plan to add a part of it to describe what you experience now or the 10 past years?
No, I had made a decision after a couple of years where this piece was presented, and I started to have this question where people say about what happened after 1999. So in 2001 or 2003, people started. So I was telling what happened or trying so, and realizing that I should make a decision about should I actualize the piece or not. And I decided not to, because I was interested, or I noticed that by re-performing the same, it's the same text that I read, also with this purpose that it is the same text that I read, the work became more and more a product, so which was in the title. Only that so it's a way of reflecting on the fact also that there are other circumstances that work on this product, although the circumstances that I talk about are someone else. So I decided I will not actualize. But I did a piece which is called Product of Other Circumstances, which is a piece I did in 2009, which uses a similar format. And of course there is a reference, but it's coming from another question. It's not supposed to be what happened after 1919, but it's about a period of time of a year or some months between 2009 and 2010.
I wanted to know if we could apply the same question that we did to this lecture that you just did to the piece in the museum. Do you think of those works that are being performed as continuing from, or a new way of thinking about the date between then and now? I guess the question is, are they a new piece?
The piece
for you?
that are Yes, they are absolutely new piece.
Great.
Thank you for staying so long and for your attention. Thank you very much.